and we were approached by an area of the US government. And frankly, we didn't go to them. They just asked if we could scale this kind of enclave type technology to suit a very specific user requirement. Never in a million years did I think we'd be deploying that into physical infra in a Pelican case that's going to be deployed into a battlefield. Valarian's one of obviously the highest growth dual purpose companies in Europe and certainly in the UK. We had some kind of early Palantir investors back us, which was amazing. I don't just want to take a bunch of random dollars from random people. I'm trying to find the best investors that can be the most helpful. And so in that round, obviously Scout's the very defense-focused fund in Austin, Texas. So that was very much a linchpin into that market. It wasn't loads of different funds. It was only 2 funds that led it. And then we had Gokul come on board as an angel as well, who's really helped us in the hiring process. I'm a very, very firm believer that there are these kind of 3 responsibilities that we face, right? It's the setting a vision, hiring people way better than you that are really, really smart, that can execute on the vision, and then frankly, just making sure you don't run out of money.
Hey everyone, this is Prashant and I'll be host for the VC 10X podcast, and today we have Max Buchan with us. Max is the co-founder and CEO of Valarian, a dual-purpose defense tech company that just emerged from stealth with a $20 million funding round. What started as a solution for data sovereignty has evolved into something much bigger. Max never imagined that the secure enclave technology he'd built would end up deployed in Pelican cases on battlefields, protecting critical infrastructure for both Fortune 500 companies and defense departments. In today's episode, Max shares how his previous company went from 0 to 55 million in revenue in just 18 to 24 months. The challenges of building technology that serves both enterprises and the Department of Defense, and why he believes we are at a really interesting moment in history for building defense-first companies in Europe. So without wasting any time, let's dive straight in. This episode is sponsored by my own podcasting agency called Podcast 10X, where I help venture capitalists, asset managers, allocators, and family offices in starting their own podcast and building a strong brand. Podcast 10X is designed in a way to work well with the busy schedule of investors, where we handle every aspect of podcast production so you can focus on investing. If you're looking to build a strong investor brand, starting a podcast should be right up your priority list. It's the only form of marketing where you can showcase your strong network, in other words, access to limited partners and founders, and grow that network further. And contrary to what most people hear, it's still very early to start a podcast. There are at least 10x more newsletters and 1000x more blogs than there are podcasts in this world. You can learn more about our podcasting services at podcast10x.com. I'll make sure to add the link in the description below. Enjoy this episode. Hey Max, so good to have you on the VC 10X podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me today on a very hot London day.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you on, and I wish you all the best for facing the heat there.
Appreciate
And
it.
yeah. So to start things off, let's talk about how Valarian has just emerged from stealth and is making significant waves in your round of $20 million also disclosed. So can you give us a brief background about your personal journey, especially your experiences at CoinShares and how that ultimately led to co-founding Valarian, and what is it all about?
Yeah, totally. So I had a really interesting experience when I came out of university here in London. So I joined the very early team of a startup back then called CoinShares, and we hadn't really raised any VC capital as it were, but we launched the first product to market, which was an exchange traded derivative out in Stockholm. And that kind of business just really rocketed. I think it was in about 18 to 24 months, we went from 0 to about 55 million in revenue. The team grew very significantly. So it was from a handful of people to, I think a couple of hundred at its peak. But I think for me, what the really interesting thing was tracking was we'd opened up quite a few entities. So we had offices in New York, London, Stockholm, Paris, and Jersey. That being the old Jersey, not the new one. And there were a lot of different regulatory authorities we were adhering to, whether it's the SEC in the US, the FCA in London, etc. And one of the issues that I was looking at and really interested in was around data exfiltration. So to give you an example, we had, tens of thousands of customers in Sweden alone. None of Swedish data should exfiltrate to the UK, etc., and other British data to France. So I ended up leaving when I was 24 to start Valarian as a digital infrastructure company. And the idea was, how do you try and basically compartmentalize compute, silo data, all that kind of stuff, so that you can securely store and make data sovereign to the nation that it was produced in. So that was the idea. It was quite a contrarian view at the time. This was probably mid 2020 when I was trying to set this up. But, for me, from a macro kind of political viewpoint, I'd lived through Brexit in the UK, and this kind of race toward physical sovereignty, right? Hong Kong had been obviously seized 20 years before we anticipated it was going to be. Obviously, we've got this war raging on still for Ukraine after a few years. And then, of course, the question mark over Taiwan. So for me, like, the kind of trend towards um, like physical sovereignty necessitated a trend towards digital sovereignty as well. So for me, that's really where the idea for the business came, and then it was all about building the right team to execute on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's quite interesting. And Valerian is described as a dual purpose defense tech company, right? For our listeners, can you briefly explain the core problem that Valerian is solving for both enterprises and governments, particularly around data control and communication in high trust environments?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so fundamentally, what we do is we build secure enclaves that can be deployed in any environment, whether that's public cloud or a piece of hardware. I mean, it goes pretty much from one extreme to the other. And then within those enclaves, or you can even think of them in a non-technical way, it's basically secure bubbles. Then you can run applications within those bubbles, and none of that data exfiltrates into other areas, either other areas of the cloud or even, frankly, different nation states, which is where we come back to. I think for me, um, going into the defense space has been really interesting because it wasn't something that we necessarily like sought to do. And I often tell this story, which is quite amusing, which is that my co-founder Josh, who we'd met a couple of years in, and he really came in a couple of years later, but still really founded the brand with me. He had spent 12 years in a business called Palantir, but he had also served 18 years in total in kind of US special operations. And I don't think, Josh has spent so much time in the government space, in the defense space. I don't think he really wanted to build a defense company again, or a dual purpose company again. But the reality was, this kind of enclave technology that was, high level really to segregate information and secure data in specific ways that obviously are a lot of military use cases for that. And we were approached by an area of the US government. And, frankly, we didn't go to them. They just asked if we could scale this kind of enclave type technology to suit a very specific user requirement. So for us, it was never really that we went to do it. We were kind of pulled into that space. But for me, now servicing kind of the national security community has been fascinating. But to go back to your question, really, the premise really of dual purpose here, or dual use technology, is, how do you build something that has applicability to both sides of the fence, right? So this enclave technology we've built that we call Acro, we can ship this to airlines, banks, pharmaceutical companies to, compartmentalize their compute or store data in specific ways. But we can also sell the very same platform to the Department of Defense, right? Obviously, there are slightly different integration points in terms of how that's used, but that's essentially the thesis.
Absolutely. That's quite interesting. So is it also can be called like a cybersecurity company, which can help maybe in a scenario of cyber warfare or cyber defense in a way of countries as well? Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to think we were very much in the cyberspace, right? And I think that's where definitions get a bit tricky. I think being in cyber generally, people think specific things. They think about either endpoint security or firewalls or something like that. For us, what I realized is really what we were building at Valarian was digital infrastructure, right? It was, how do you build a foundational kind of deployable infra that you can deploy in any environment, whether that's frankly, on the battlefield, whether it's in a public cloud, whatever, in order to really securely compartmentalize data. So that was the piece that I realized had taken us a bit out of the cyberspace. We definitely very much do touch the cybersecurity arena, but this is much more infrastructural. Like, we're looking out kind of 5-10 years, and how do we build the critical infrastructural technologies that's going to safeguard the data, both on an enterprise level, but also the kind of governmental institutions that kind of protect our Western democratic freedom. So that was really our kind of North Star.
Got it. Interesting. And operating in a very sensitive field, working with governments, and defense departments. Uh, one thing that is absolutely table stake is that you have to build that credibility and build that trust with the stakeholders to make them believe that, okay, this is a product that we can actually trust and deploy in those sensitive environments, and see if it works, right? So how do you build that trust, especially in the early journey, which you're in right now, and which you were in even earlier to that, maybe let's say a few months prior when you were starting out, right? How did you initially validate the idea and get some early traction? How did you convince these stakeholders that your solution is worthy of being deployed in such environments?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think this is the piece that I would say that like, you the beginning, we very much didn't target government, etc. I mean, it's renowned to be very, very long sales cycles, very niche, very bespoke type things. And when I get asked now about selling into government, for instance, I like my answer tends to be the same, which is that it's the same really as whatever kind of technology we are building. That if the need is strong enough, there will always be a path, right, to procurement, right? And that could be in a bank, but it also could be in a defensive institution. I mean, if for instance, like Ukraine's a great example. I mean, the speed of procurement that kicked off right after the Russian invasion. In some ways, we hadn't really seen anything like that. But it's when for instance, and I'm not talking about us here, but I'm talking about, for instance, like drones or counter drone technology, how quickly that was procured into Ukraine. That would be an example of when the need is strong enough. Now, to kind of bring this back to Valarian, as I mentioned, we started it really as a solo enterprise company. So we were building this kind of like enclave technology to ring fence data for airlines or banks or whatever. Now, what did help, I think, was the type of investor and the caliber of investor that we had. And the examples I would use on the UK front, and there's a fund that I really, really rate in the UK, which is called MD1, and it's run by a friend of mine who was in the British Special Forces in the SBS, and then ended up running a national security focus fund in the UK and Europe. Now, he's obviously been immensely helpful to the journey. It's actually how I met my co-founder, Josh, because Josh had been in the US Special Forces. Now, that's been super interesting. And folks like him, and then we also have an amazing angel investor who served on the strategic defense review of the Ministry of Defense in the UK. And she was, she's been a really fascinating figure in that kind of whole space. But then the other piece I would really quickly mention is, you're right, we recently did a round, and that was co-led by a fund called Scout in Austin, Texas. And Scout's got a really, really great reputation in the US for being defense focused. And for us, given the fact that we are a British company, but we are actually deploying in the US a lot of the time, for me, getting that kind of legitimacy of working with phenomenal investors in that space was really, really important. And Scout's been incredibly helpful for us. And I think the last piece that I would mention, because there's a kind of fascinating duality between like raising capital in the US, but then deploying it in Europe. And I think for me, it's like an interesting arbitrage, which is like you have this knowledge base and you have this, total of capital in the US. But for me right now, with the geopolitical climate as it is, which is frankly the US spending less on NATO, committing less to NATO, and everything. And frankly, for the first time in a really long time, European nations having to massively stand on their own 2 feet, but also not procure as much American software. I think it's a really interesting time in history to be building a kind of a defense first company here. Obviously still with private capital from the US, but also from a government standpoint, working with European institutions. So for me, it's kind of it's an amalgamation of a lot of different factors at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. And talking about the go-to-market aspect, I would believe that would be different for the enterprise clients versus the government clients. So give us an insight into what that looks like on both these sides, and how do these two pathways inform each other, if at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something we are very much in flight with right now. I mean, the thing of being a growing company is you are learning these every day. But that is very much one of the learnings, which is they are quite different streams, right? Your kind of defensive federal business is a really different type of company to the enterprise business. They might share the same technology, but the go-to-market motion is different. I mean, I would say one thing I didn't mention actually is we appointed a chairman last year who is one of the most phenomenal go-to-market people I've met in my life. So he co-founded a business called Dark Trace, was probably the most successful British cybersecurity company in history. And Nick was originally the co-founder, chief revenue officer. Now, when Darktrace, I think, got to 500 million ARR, he moved to be the chief operating officer. Obviously, they went public, and then they got bought last year by a big PE shop. But I think for me, I have been able to lean on Nick a lot for the more enterprise-specific go-to-market motion, because the repeatability and scalability is so important. And for me, Darktrace really was my inspiration. Even before I knew Nick, frankly, it was always because they had gone from 0 to 10,000 customers, about $1 billion in revenue. I mean, it was a really weighty British company. We don't have a lot of them in the UK, frankly. And so that was the really, really like the poster child for that. Whereas on the defensive side, it's such a closed community. It's very much like get as close as possible to the end user, right? And the end users are very, frankly, in very different climates to the end user in a bank. Make sure that you're providing value, but then also, build legitimization for yourself in certain circles, because it's so unbelievably interconnected, the whole NatSec world, that building trust is the single most important thing. And that's and especially when people are like really trying to help you, making sure the technology really does catch up to all the things you're wanting to do. And I think the last point I'd make is on this side, because we're growing so quickly, we also take inspiration from companies that we really respect. Like, so if you take a company like Anduril, for instance, that I'm sure you're very well familiar with in the US, Anduril has so many fascinating strategic capabilities, but they haven't necessarily built them all in-house. Some of them, they've been mini acquisitions, they've raised a lot of capital, and then deploying that by not just, organic growth, but inorganic growth. And that's obviously something we're looking at with Valarian, because we're growing so fast that for me, there's this interesting moment in time around kind of like compiling together strategic capabilities and how do we bring in other types of technologies, bolt it onto our Acro platform, all that stuff. So I'm hoping with that kind of velocity, we will be able to service both sides of the coin pretty easily.
Absolutely. And on the government side specifically, how complex is it versus the enterprise side, uh, in order of magnitude or multiples maybe? And what are the specific challenges on the selling to government side of things that are specific to government selling that are not there in enterprise selling? It can be enforcing delays, managing people that are not very responsive, but they are the stakeholders, you have to deal with them, right? So how do you manage all that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think to take this more from a product perspective first, I think what I've noticed is that, the foundationally, obviously you have to have something really, really important, but I have noticed, not just through us, but some peers in the space, you can almost have something 90% ready. You almost don't want to have the fully formed product in a lot of cases, just because some of it is so much more bespoke. Like there are so many situations where you might have something that covers 90% of the user need in the defensive space. But given the fact that either you're going to be working with classified information or you're going to be working with a bunch of end users that are so different to in the enterprise space, there's going to need to be some bespoke integration. But the good thing about that is oftentimes when you do start winning those early contracts, and obviously in the US, the DoD has got a fantastic program called the Cyber Stream, which goes through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, which is very much for this, which is almost the subsidizing of building out that remaining 10%, because that remaining 10% might be a bit bespoke. I think that compared to the enterprise, where you do need to get the product obviously completely production ready, and then it needs to be just kind of rinse and repeat of how many banks can you go to, how many pharma companies, how many airlines, whatever, if you're in the enterprise space. So I think that's been, I would say from a product perspective, that's been my observation about where you can get to. The challenge with dual purpose is obviously making sure the kind of underlying platform itself is applicable to both pieces. And I'll give you an example about this with us, which is something just really fascinating. We've never been in the hardware business. Like, that's not been our thing. However, we had one customer in the defensive space saying, hey, this Acro enclave platform, can you run this on, basically a miniature server, put it in a Pelican case, so that we can go into the battlefield, throw the Pelican case on the ground, and then essentially create a segregated private network that's localized to all the frontline people. Now, obviously, I can't say who those people are or where they would be, but you can kind of imagine the types of situations. And that would be an example of what I was saying about, we can get it 90% of the way there. We had this Acro platform that was had a lot of utility. Never in a million years did I think we'd be deploying that into physical infra in a Pelican case that's going to be deployed into a battlefield. So that's an example of, you can get it 90% of the way there, and then you just have to be really cognizant. You need to listen to the end user requirement, especially in the defense arena.
Absolutely. Yeah, quite interesting. And talking about fundraising with your recent round closing, right? Notably with investors that have also backed some really successful companies in the space like Palantir. What was your approach to fundraising? With your esteemed list of investors that you have been able to onboard, were they right on your target list that these are the people I want to have on my cap table, right? And did you reach out to them the first thing that you wanted, or was there a process to getting to them? If yes, then what was that process? So give us an insight into your fundraising thinking and how did you approach it?
Look, it's a really great question. My experience with this is it does get a tiny bit easier as you go along, right? Just because, you're not knocking on a lot of cold doors anymore. A lot of folks have heard through the grapevine what you're up to. And we've got one fascinating angel investor who's been unbelievably helpful to me, even though he's only just come on board, called Gokul, who you might know is on the board of Coinbase and on the board of Pinterest and stuff. And, whenever I have an issue or a problem I'm working through, I'll ping Gokul and he'll come back within kind of 5 minutes. But I had gotten a cold email from Gokul. He's a phenomenal guy. And, he just said, "Hey, I've heard about what you guys are doing. Really, really cool." So, I mean, that was awesome. And obviously that is after a bunch of hard work of knocking on doors and having conversations. But I would say it is a little bit of a flywheel that starts. I think for me, rather than specific investors in this round, it was much more of like, how can we get the folks that would help the most get to the stage where we're going to, right? And so, like, I think Valarian's one of obviously the highest growth dual purpose companies in Europe and certainly the UK. I realized that given the kind of level of my expectations of where the company's going to get to, we needed to start taking American capital as soon as physically possible, right? And so, you're absolutely right. We had some kind of early Palantir investors back us, which was amazing. Obviously, Scout's the very defense-focused fund in Austin, Texas, so that was very much a linchpin into that market. And so it was much more about like strategically thinking, I don't just want to take a bunch of random dollars from random people. I'm trying to find the best investors that can be the most helpful. And so in that round, it was only it wasn't loads of different funds. It was only two funds that led it, and then we had Gokul come on board as an angel as well, who's really helped us in the hiring process. Because I think that would be the last thing is, I'm a very, very firm believer that there are these kind of three responsibilities that we face, right? It's the setting a vision, hiring people way better than you that are really, really smart, that can execute on the vision, and then frankly, just making sure you don't run out of money. And those are the things. But for where we are right now in this space, the war for talent is really, really important, right? And so for me, getting exposure both to West and East Coast engineers has been really important. We have a small engineering shop as well in Amsterdam. There are a lot of great engineers in the Netherlands now because obviously Uber and Databricks opened up big offices there. So yeah, going where the talent is as well. And I think for me, raising that capital was so important for the hiring journey. So yeah, I mean, I would say it's on the capital raising side, to any kind of your founders listening to this, it's obviously a lot harder in the early days when you're trying to build the momentum. But I think for me, just being really product focused and end user focused, making sure you have enough momentum. And then I feel like the fundraising almost kind of is a flywheel that keeps going. And most of the time, investors are approaching you at the end of the day than the other way around, just because once you create that momentum. Obviously, in the early days, it is a lot harder, and it's just a bit more manual to create the flywheel.
Absolutely, completely agree there. And yes, Gokul Rajaraman is an incredible investor, and his portfolio looks amazing. A lot of winners, unicorns in there. So, and if you could help us get him on the podcast, that would be amazing. But yeah, just nudging you on that. Besides, after the fundraise, how did you think about allocating the capital? How did you segregate the fundraise? That okay, we have raised this much we're going to allocate to hiring, this much to product development, and this much to something else. Give us an insight into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, really, everything's about engineering. We've kind of have we have never really had a pipeline problem. I mean, the issue for us that we're trying to solve is such a momentous one. Pretty much everyone we've spoken to, whether it's enterprise or defensive, has some kind of use case within that remit. The issue is making sure we can deliver, right? Always, because we have a fundamental platform, but when you're trying to deliver at pace and make sure things are production ready with a fairly lean team, everything is about engineering, right? And that's why we've focused on a couple of really great hires out of places like Palantir, who have done a really good job at listening to customer requirements and building on top of that. That being said, we don't want to go super into the bespoke build. Palantir did that really well, obviously, with their kind of forward deployed engineer model, which can really work well. But just given the pace that we're on, the scalability demands, for us, it's about just the repeatability of use cases, etc. So I would say really spending that money for me, it's all about engineering. Because we had this incredible pipeline contracts, which are they tend to be fairly big, especially when you're working with these large defensive institutions. It's just a question of delivery, and so that's really what Josh, my COO, and I focus on every day, is just bringing in the best engineers in the world. We're super proud of our engineering team already, but adding to that is our main focus.
Absolutely. You mentioned about hiring and building a team, right? And how Gokul is also helping you build that. Can you share some of those learnings that you've gotten from him and also from your own work? How do you think about hiring? What are the key insights that can also be helpful to other founders listening?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's, as all the other founders listening will know, so it's a real war for talent, and for us, like, one of the use cases, for instance, of the enclave technology is securing AI models, right? It's compartmentalizing, you know, normal information from like classified information in terms of what's going to be ingested to an LLM. And these are like really, obviously, really strict requirements, especially when you're talking about the national security community and starting to run these LLMs. What that, necessitates is a, war for talent over some of the hottest companies in the world right now. Now, I'm not saying like it's, we're going neck on neck with OpenAI. We've all seen the ridiculous pay packages coming out there, but it's very much true that we are still competing with much larger companies in the space who are doing interesting things. And we are, with the best one in the world, a really early stage company. Now, the way in which I think we win, and we have been winning, is very much the same reason I love what I do, right? Is like some of the stuff we're working on, especially in the NatSec community, it's really important in terms of, like, as I mentioned earlier, like Western democratic freedoms, protecting sovereignty, all the stuff that really matters. So when I wake up in the morning, it's just really cool and really exciting that I get to go and work on some problems that I really believe matter for the world. Not just for our technological supremacy, but also for kind of like, the citizens' rights in the, in our Western nation. So I think for me, that same narrative a lot of the time is what some of the top engineers in the world want to come and do, right? It's the same with Palantir in the early days. Maybe not so much now because obviously it's a publicly traded company, it's a Fortune 500 company. But Josh was telling me, when he joined Palantir in 2011, so mission driven, right? It's not, people are rarely there for the salary. It's really about what are people creating? Why is this important? And I think for me, it's the same at Valarian. It's that similar thing to early days Palantir, which is what we're building really, really matters to the world and, and to national sovereignty and to national security. That's we might not be able to compete necessarily on the salary game, but that is something really important. And of course, then we incentivize a lot with equity and stuff, so that everyone can encompass the upside that we're going through right now.
Absolutely, that's completely there. And talking about high quality talent that can be anywhere, it's not necessary that you have to poach someone from a big firm. They can be working at another startup, and they might just really be good there. Uh, how do you find those kind of people that are at those unrecognized companies but are really high quality? And then do your outreach to them and try to get them on board, obviously at more reasonable packages than you'd have to pay to someone who already has a great CV.
Absolutely. And this might be a bit contrarian, but I mean, I actually sometimes find it's inversely correlated in the sense that, like, when you're hiring people from quote unquote big companies who are used to having large teams and large budgets, some of these technical folks haven't even written a line of code in 8 years, right? Those are, we're just really steering away from that. And so you're really indexing toward, from a cultural fit, toward like, um, velocity of product builds, proximity to the problem, and proximity to the code. Because we don't want a bunch of engineering managers who frankly just want to sit there and hire a team of 50 people and maybe someday we'll get something out. And look, that's not always the case. I mean, and frankly, not to talk about Palantir too much, but they have done a great job in terms of they also build really small teams within the company that can execute on specific things. And Ariel's really good at that as well. There are a bunch of companies doing it really well. So it's not all companies, but you do see some really large scale tech companies, and there's definitely been a washout of middle management, obviously, in the last 3 to 4 years. But that is obviously something we track against. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you can hire from really small startups as well, that someone just has the skill set that they need. I mean, in terms of engineering, I mean, that just comes down to kind of skill set, right? And knowledge base. It doesn't really matter the company that they come out of. The trouble is for us, it's more the kind of making sure we get to see them, right? I mean, we post a job and we'll have 1,000 applicants, and we're a fairly small company, but obviously it's just because we're growing quickly. So it's that balance. But yeah, for me, it's really about attitude, but also about capability, much more than the kind of brand that people are coming from.
Absolutely. Makes perfect sense. Great. And how do you think about building a moat around Valerian and building a company that is defensible in the highly competitive market?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question, because obviously there's the like the obvious answer that I don't think always works is the IP side. Obviously, we've generated a bunch of IP, we've filed like 10 patents and all that stuff, but the reality is that's not going to, as they say about patents, it just depends how expensive lawyers you have to defend them, etc. I think for me, the defensibility is more in terms of the network effects of, you get in production deployment. Obviously, what we do is pretty critical infrastructure. So once you're there, it's, assuming it works and people are happy, which obviously they are, that moat becomes, are they really going to rip out something they deem as critical infrastructure, right? That, in 5 years, we might start to see competition, etc. I think for where we are right now, we haven't competed directly on tenders with other companies. Now, I can see a world in 18, 24 months where, cloud companies like Databricks or Snowflake start really looking at sovereign stuff like we're doing, whether it's Palantir, etc. But I think for right now, for us, it's really first to market, deploying really critical infrastructural solutions, and then doubling down on what we're already doing. And I think on the government side, I think being the first to market, but also building the more kind of slightly more bespoke, additive integrations on top as well. I think for me, this is very, very sticky, tight technology. But it's also the reason like this wasn't easy to build. I mean, as I said, I started mid 2020, right? And it took us probably 2 orders of magnitude longer than I anticipated it was going to take. I thought we'll bash it out in a couple of months. The reality of this, the sophistication and complexity of building this kind of infra technology did take us a few years. Now that we've got there in production, we are fortunately, it kind of does equate to some kind of moat just in terms of time that it takes to build this kind of stuff. So I would say the technological piece, and then frankly, just the rollout type piece into production.
Right. How do you think about product market fit at Valerian?
So look, I do think this slightly, I mean, I know we've spoken about this a few times in the conversation. It does slightly depend on whether we're talking about enterprise or government, right? I think on the latter point, go to market is, it's pretty clear cut, right? Either it makes sense or it doesn't, and you find that out really, really quickly, right? And because it's such a tightly knit community, you can present, and it might have some product market fit in one use case and not the other, but then you can slightly integrate into something else, and it might do that. So product market fit is really, really binary really quickly in the defense space, and that feedback loop is incredibly quickly, I think, also because the community is so tight knit. Now on the enterprise piece, obviously that's the market is in the TAM is pretty infinitely large, right? Especially when we're talking about, whether it's sovereign AI, whether it's digital sovereignty, whatever it is, most institutions around the world that you think about are thinking about this in some guise. I think the product market fit is not necessarily will they buy the product, it's how many people in the enterprise space will buy the same product, right? Because I don't want to end up having 100 slightly different products in the enterprise space. So for me, PMF in the enterprise space is how repeatable and scalable is a single offering, right? It's like, can I address 90% of needs in 90% of the instances that they arise, right? Guess that's how I look at it. The kind of my North Star for that is how many times can the exact same use case be deployed? Business after business after business. That's how I look at it in the enterprise space, is the repeatability aspect.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Uh, Talking about metrics, right? What are some key metrics that you obsess over at Valerian?
I think the main one that really ties into the last piece, right, which is like, on the enterprise basis, it's really how much, how many businesses can I go to with the same use case, and how many production instances can I do with the very same technology, the same use case. I think it's hard as well to run metrics between the two sides, right? Because for instance, you might have one customer in the defensive space, but the contract value might be the same to 300 customers in the enterprise space. Now, because not just because of the contract value, but just because of the size and the robustness and the importance of that contract, right? Because you might be servicing, frankly, not just a government institution, but something that underpins something for a huge amount of citizens in a given country, right? You might be running critical digital infrastructure for a sovereign state that needs to protect their citizens from malign or malicious activity, right? And so it's hard to compare basically essentially one customer, even though it's a really big footprint. I think for me, on the defensive side, I like to think about how many end users are we helping. I think that tends to be a better metric than revenue, contract size, etc. Because you might only have, we're fortunate that we are working with quite a few government institutions. But sometimes even if you have one, but the contract is quite sizable, and you are servicing a ton of end users, like for instance, you could have a single contract with the Defense Digital department in the UK, which is part of the Ministry of Defense, but that could be at 100,000 users. I think on the enterprise side, the metric, as I mentioned before, that I look at is how many how many signups, how many production instances can we get to with a unified product. And so, for instance, when we sell our Acro platform, we're working on very much the open SDK model, which is allowing the end user within a bank or whatever to run their own containerized applications within the Acro platform, which makes it a lot easier for them to just build on top, and them not having to worry about how they deploy into a very secure Kubernetes cluster, how they do this with pretty high velocity, given how much they create their own enterprise application. So I think those, I appreciate a slightly long answer, but I obviously am running almost slightly different companies based on the same technology. And so I kind of think about this, dual hatted all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's I think that's a very important point you made, that you're running maybe two companies rolled into one in a way, right? And different GTMs, different PMF, different metrics, right? How do you organize that at the company level inside the organizational structure? Maybe you have separate teams for certain things, or maybe one facing the enterprise side, one facing government side. Any segregation of the team on what all fronts is that, at what all levels is that, and how do you personally as the founder try to separate these two things, and how you're thinking about these two verticals?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'm lucky that I work with, so my COO Josh also kind of runs the American business, and we have two entities in the US, right? But obviously he spent so long in the kind of special forces arena in the US. He kind of, the right type of clearances that he used to hold, etc. It makes more sense for him, especially on the US governmental side. So that's really helpful. Obviously, I sit here in London. And I think from an engineering perspective, we very much have a core platform engineering team who build our product, which is called Acro. Now, what we are noticing is based on the integration points, whether it's, as I mentioned earlier, for a defensive institution that needs to have work with classified information, etc. We're in the process of hiring kind of security cleared engineers. I mean, we just hired one in Texas, for instance, and also someone else in Colorado, and they will be responsible for very much that side, which is really, I mentioned the kind of 90% similarities. That's really the additional 10%. where you might have to have security cleared engineers for really specific DoD use cases. I think for me though, the majority of the engineering team does focus on the enterprise piece because that's the more repeatable part of the business, right? And then, as I said, you have that very much foundational engineering team at the same time. And frankly, as I mentioned, we have also looked at the potential of acquiring more companies across Europe, especially like because it's in terms of hiring and stuff, like almost kind of acquiring companies as well and bringing that in. And I think just given the trajectory that we're on, we'll probably get to about 100 employees at the end of Q1 next year. And I think that will be from the scale that we will probably start to more specifically segment who's in the defensive aspect, Valarian Defense as it's called, who's in Valarian Enterprise, etc. But the reality of this is the core engineering team are very much platform engineers, and they very much sit between them.
Absolutely. And from what I believe, you're a first time founder, right? And all these things are really complex in their own way, and everything, every day a new thing comes up that you have to deal with, right? How do you learn these new things? How do you learn to tackle these things? Who are the people that you go to solve these things when you need help? Give me an insight into that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when I was at CoinShares, I was I worked for the founder and CEO at the time called Ryan Radloff, who was this incredible operator. And because I was so close to him, I kind of felt like I'd gone through the journey. And then when I actually started a company, I then called Brian. I was like, oh, I just didn't realize how much you actually shielded me from what was going on, even though I felt very close to the founding journey. And so you're absolutely right. Being an actual first-time founder, even if you have gone through a high velocity, high growth companies, it's a really, really different experience. I think for me, like the right investors and advisors have been incredibly important. I'm a firm believer that the wrong investors can be really detrimental to a company, but the right investors can be extremely additive. And working with people that really, we're all on the same side. Everyone really, really wants to go this the same way. And then, as I said, the right advisors. I mean, for me as well, working with like tier one founders that you really, really respect. I mean, as I mentioned, our chairman founded probably one of the most seismic companies to ever come out of the UK. And I think it's really wonderful to be able to speak to someone like Nick who, scaled a business from zero to thousands of employees. And so it's, having someone with you that's just been through the experience is really, really important. And I would definitely say to, especially other first-time founders listening to this, is I do think the kind of advisory piece, the mentor piece of someone who's actually been there and done it, right? Because everyone wants to pontificate about life and everyone wants to theorize on, about advice, but actually having people in your corner that have done the thing is incredibly important. You want practical life lessons, not just kind of pontification. So that's one of my big beliefs here.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice there for first time founders as well. Uh, as the founder of a high growth startup, so many things are evolving, so many things you have to tackle every day. Sometimes it takes a toll on your mental health, right? And sometimes it's just too much to take, right? How do you take care of your mental health? What are the practices that you indulge in to bring some sanity into the chaos that's all around you?
I don't know. I think we secretly all really love the chaos, right? I think that's why we chose to do what we did, because we're not necessarily like neurotypical people. I think that being the slightly glib answer, I think the reality is like, I think personal relationships are the most important, both like familial. And I do think, I think I did that really badly when I started. I think familial relationships are so important, family and really dear friends are so important to invest in, especially, really you're going to be doing this for a decade. If you want to build a really big thing, it's going to be a decade, right? It's not going to be 18 months and then you're going to go away. You are running this marathon, not a sprint. But then I also think like within the company, it's incredibly important to have folks that you can lean on. I'm fortunate to have a phenomenal business partner in Josh. I have a phenomenal chief of staff in Chicago that's been with us really since the early days. Obviously, a chairman that's built and scaled a phenomenal company, and then a couple of mentors. I think it's, interpersonal relationships, whether it's family or frankly like colleagues, I think is really, really important because I mean, that's the only way you're going to be able to share the burden, right? I think the risk is when people internalize everything, don't share it with any other humans. I think that's when it's insurmountable. But I think the reality is solving things with other really bright people with good senses of humor is really important.
Absolutely. With that, we'll come to the last main question before we go for the closing questions. And this is looking back at Valerian's journey so far. What do you think has been the most pivotal decision that you made that made a significant impact on how the company has shaped up or the growth trajectory of the company?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people that have been following me for a while will know that like I founded the company under a different name and we were building this infra piece and then we kind of rebranded to Valarian. I had met Josh, I brought in Josh as a co-founder. We kind of restructured the company and we really made it what it is. Now, it was this huge evolution that was unbelievably painful. Like it was the most painful thing I've ever been through. And frankly, probably cost me a bunch of friends as well. But the reality was like, you know, the only, the path for me was really clear. Like I doubled down on what we were doing. I knew I could see the market in the defense space. And sometimes you just have to make the really difficult decisions and think like, you can see the path and it's, you just have to execute. The reality is you're not always going to be, be able to be friends with everyone along the process. But I think making the hard decision and really quickly is really, really important because the reality is if you kind of know something is the right thing, but you wait a year to do it, you've lost a year, you've lost a year of burn rate, and you've lost a lot of people's confidence. I think acting fast and decisively when you are super aware what the right decision is, I think for me has served us really, really well.
Absolutely. Great point there. With that, we'll come to the closing questions. Where can people learn more about what you're building at Valerian, and where can our listeners follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I use LinkedIn. I've been told I need to start using X. I think I've posted once in about 10 years on that. But I will endeavor to get more active on X at some point. But yeah, LinkedIn I'm using fairly frequently as well. So do follow me there if you can.
Absolutely. I'll make sure to give you a follow on X to get you started there.
Thanks, mate.
Great. Great having you on, Max. Lovely what you're building. Godspeed. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Good stuff. Thanks so much for having me. All right, mate. Take care.